Now the memory stung. Loneliness pressed against him like a physical weight. Every room in the house echoed with my absence, every shadow felt like a reminder that I was gone, that he had been left behind. He thought of the summer stretching endlessly, of bottles shattered in frustration, of trees battered with a bat, of nights spent crying silently into his pillow, hoping somehow I would return. His thoughts returned obsessively to me, Noah, the one who had left, the one who had moved on, the one he still loved. Even in his fury, his jealousy, his reckless antics, it all stemmed from that aching, unrelenting devotion. He wanted me back, he needed me back, and no matter what chaos he unleashed, no matter the fire or gunshots, the obsession never faded. Talia sighed, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Noah, Tate doesn't have the emotional maturity to express his feelings the way most people do. He can't always put it into words, so he smashes things, he lashes out, he destroys what he can when he feels powerless or hurt. I listened, absorbing every word, trying to reconcile the chaos outside with the boy I once knew. He waited by the mailbox each afternoon, Talia continued, her voice softer now, tinged with both pity and frustration. Hoping you'd come home, hoping you'd walk down that driveway, but you didn't until yesterday. His uncles Tim and Joey were here the whole month because I needed their influence to make my son manageable. The morning you left, the house was quiet, even though Tate's uncles were here. Tate felt so lonely with you not here, Noah. I nodded slowly, the truth settling in my chest. I see, I murmured. Talia studied me for a moment, her expression gentle but firm. He missed you, he wanted you every single day, but, she hesitated, letting the silence hang heavy with implication. I frowned, the confusion and frustration bubbling up. If he missed me, why avoid me, why stay upstairs all day instead of, I don't know, talking to me? Talia sighed again, rubbing her temples. Because Noah, that's how he protects himself. He's terrified of rejection, terrified of showing you how much he cares. He thinks if he stays distant, if he punishes the world instead of you, maybe he can survive the pain of missing you. He's hurting, yes, but he's scared too. Tate gets jealous in a way that most people don't understand, Talia explained to Noah. When he's hurt, he doesn't know how to reach out, he withdraws. He'll brood, climb into bed, and hide from the world. His thinking is simple: if he can disappear, then whatever is hurting him can't find him. She paused, looking toward the room where Tate had retreated. My son has never truly attached to anyone outside of our family. Before he met you, I tried to arrange playdates, hoping he would learn how to connect with other children. He would hide under his bed and cry. He was so withdrawn that I seriously considered taking him to a child psychologist. Talia sighed softly. He never really had friends growing up in Lowe's Angels. Tate has always kept people at a distance. He feels things deeply, but he doesn't know how to express them in a healthy way. When he feels abandoned, ignored, or replaced, his emotions come out sideways. He can become cold, he can become silent, sometimes he can even become cruel. She looked at Noah with a sadness that came from years of watching her son struggle. He isn't trying to hurt people, he just never learned what to do with the hurt inside him. After I finally gave up trying to arrange playdates when Tate was a young adolescent, Talia explained, I had to accept that it was probably never going to happen. He wasn't going to suddenly open up because I kept putting him in situations that made him uncomfortable. She looked down, remembering those years. So I encouraged his aunts and uncles to take him out instead. They took him to the cinema, on long drives to historical sites, shopping trips, and auto shows. Little things that gave him a reason to leave the house and experience the world. Because honestly, I don't know if he would have left home or even connected with people at school if he hadn't found you. Talia's voice softened. Tate was always closest to Uncle Tim and Uncle Joey, Talia explained, but especially Joey. They had a bond that was different from the others. She smiled faintly at the memory. They would spend hours together, going on long drives, stopping at arcades, ice cream shops, and game stores. Joey wasn't much older than Tate, so sometimes he felt less like an uncle and more like an older brother. Her expression grew more serious. Joey was 10 years older and gave Tate something he desperately needed. Joey was patient with him. He showed him kindness and the kind of fatherly affection that helped him feel safe. Without Joey's influence, without someone who understood him and accepted him exactly as he was, I honestly don't know where Tate would be emotionally. He'd probably be an emotionless zombie or worse. She paused. I think he would have become completely shut off from the world. I can't even imagine how withdrawn he would be now if you hadn't come into his life. I'm not sure if you're aware, Talia said, but Tate was once incredibly close to every member of his family. They were his entire world. She looked down, choosing her words carefully. But then life changed. They grew older, got married, took on careers, and had responsibilities of their own. They still loved him, but they couldn't make him the center of their lives the way they had when he was younger. Tate didn't understand that. He didn't see it as life moving forward, he saw it as being replaced. Talia sighed. He took it very personally. He started pushing people away because he didn't know how to handle feeling like he wasn't someone's first priority anymore. He didn't want to compete for attention or affection, so he cut people off before they could hurt him. She paused. Uncle Joey was the last person in the family that Tate turned against. He convinced himself that Joey was gone from his life, even though Joey was still there and still cared about him. Her voice softened. I don't think Tate ever learned how to attach to people in a healthy way. Even as a child, he was so withdrawn. There were times when he would just lie in his bed and cry. It was incredibly difficult to get him to come out of his room to eat or to do ordinary things. Talia looked at Noah. He wasn't a child who didn't feel anything. He felt everything. He just never learned what to do with those feelings. The worst period I ever witnessed, Talia said quietly, was after we moved to Los Angeles and Uncle Joey couldn't come around as much because he was away at school. She looked saddened by the memory. Tate was only 4 years old. He would lie on his bed and cry for his uncle. I don't mean just a few tears. He would become overwhelmed with missing him. He would have long emotional outbursts and spend months asking when Joey was coming back. Even at preschool, he struggled because he was carrying around that sadness. Talia shook her head. It was heartbreaking to watch a little boy feel that kind of loss. We tried to comfort him, but nothing seemed to replace that connection he had with Joey. She looked at Noah. But then he met you. After that, something changed. Tate still had his struggles, but he had someone he trusted, someone who made him feel understood. Talia paused. He didn't really break down like that again, not until after your birthday last year when you left this house. Her words hung in the warm air of the garden, heavy with the truth I'd never fully understood. Tate's destruction, his fury, his obsession. It wasn't just cruelty or jealousy. It was love he didn't know how to show and fear that didn't know how to release. Talia smiled softly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Noah, he's really hurt right now, she said, reaching over to touch my arm lightly. He feels like a dog who's been kicked, lost, confused, and angry all at once. He feels abandoned, again, and this time it's worse because you chose another body, someone he hates. I swallowed hard, trying to picture Tate in that state. You mean, Mark? I asked quietly, my voice tight. Talia nodded. Yes, that's part of it. He's wounded Noah deeply, and the way he shows it. Well, hurt people don't always cry. Hurt people don't always rage in ways anyone can understand. Sometimes they shoot thousands of bullets instead. I blinked, absorbing the weight of her words. Thousands, I whispered, just to deal with the pain. Exactly, Talia said, her tone firm but gentle. Every shot, every cracked bottle, every tree hit with that bat, it's a reflection of how raw his jealousy is, how deeply hurt he is. Each bullet is like a scream he can't say out loud, and it's not just anger, Noah. It's grief, longing, frustration that he doesn't know how to express in any other way. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. I guess I didn't realize it was that bad, I admitted. I thought, I don't know, he was just being dramatic. Talia shook her head, her expression softening. No, he's always dramatic, yes, but underneath it there's something fragile, something desperate. He missed you like crazy every day you were gone. He missed the life you shared before the summer you graduated high school. And now seeing you with someone else, even just sharing space, he doesn't know what to do with it. So he destroys things. He fires bullets into the air and lashes out at the world instead of facing the rawness of his feelings. I nodded slowly, the truth pressing down on me like a physical weight. So, the shots, the chaos, it's his way of telling me he cares, I asked quietly, almost to myself. Yes, Talia said gently, her eyes locking onto mine. It's twisted, destructive, and exhausting to watch, but it's love, Noah, pure, desperate love, and jealousy, and hurt. He wants you and he's afraid of losing you, afraid you won't come back to him. I let out a shaky laugh, partly from disbelief, partly from guilt. I can't believe I didn't see it, I said softly. I've been gone, I just assumed he'd move on, or, I don't know, that he'd get over me. Talia shook her head again, almost tenderly. He never moves on, Noah, not from you, not fully. That's why the house feels like a war zone sometimes and why every bullet makes your ears ring. It's raw and it's messy, but it's him trying to live with the heartbreak he can't speak. I leaned back against the garden wall, letting her words sink in, feeling a mix of guilt, awe, and longing. God, I guess I have a lot to fix, I murmured, almost under my breath. And it's not just about the bullets. Talia smiled faintly, squeezing my arm. No, Noah, it's not, but recognizing it, that's the first step. Now you just have to figure out how to reach him without making it worse. I nodded again, staring toward the window upstairs, knowing Tate was probably watching, seething, and hurting all at once, and realizing I couldn't ignore him any longer. My mother's funeral was simple, dignified, and peaceful. Talia had offered to help with many of the arrangements. She had a woman's touch for those kinds of things, gentle, thoughtful, and attentive to details I never would have considered. She had met my mother several times over the years, so she understood her far better than any stranger planning a funeral ever could. She insisted on paying for an elegant coffin, saying my mother deserved to be laid to rest with dignity. I was grateful, though I struggled to find the words to tell her. My contribution was choosing the tombstone. After staring at countless examples for what felt like hours, I finally settled on a simple inscription. Devoted wife, beloved mother. It wasn't elaborate, but it captured the woman she had been better than any long speech ever could. The ceremony itself was quiet and respectful. Soft music drifted through the chapel as family, friends, and a handful of acquaintances gathered to pay their respects. A few people stood to share memories of my mother, stories about her kindness, her patience, and the little ways she made people feel welcome. Their words reached my ears, but they felt distant, as though I were listening from underwater. I remained mostly silent. The grief hadn't fully arrived yet. Instead, I felt strangely hollow, moving through each moment as though someone else were living it for me. I accepted condolences, shook hands, and thanked people for coming because it was what I was supposed to do, not because I truly registered any of it. When the service ended and everyone slowly drifted away, Talia and I began the quiet walk home. Neither of us said much. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, there simply wasn't anything that needed to be said. As soon as we stepped inside the house, the exhaustion I'd been holding back settled over me like a heavy blanket. Every part of me felt drained. I think I'm going to lie down for a while, I said quietly. Talia gave me a sympathetic nod. Get some rest, she replied softly. You've been carrying a lot today. I nodded, walked to my room, and eased myself onto the bed. Staring at the ceiling, I waited for tears that never came. All I felt was an overwhelming numbness, as though my mind had decided it simply couldn't process any more pain. Within minutes, I closed my eyes and drifted into an uneasy sleep. Before I drifted off to sleep, my thoughts wandered back to the funeral, and inevitably to Tate. He had worn an immaculate black suit that matched the dark expression fixed on his face. Throughout the entire service, he never once looked at me, not a single glance. He never approached me, never offered his condolences, and never spoke a word. His hands stayed clenched so tightly at his sides they were almost fists, as if he were forcing himself to remain where he was. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world. After the burial, during the small reception, I noticed him quietly drinking a few glasses of champagne. Even then, he deliberately kept his distance from me, weaving around conversations and positioning himself on the opposite side of the room whenever I happened to be nearby. I couldn't tell whether he was angry, grieving, uncomfortable, or simply trying to avoid me. Whatever was going through his mind remained hidden behind the cold, unreadable expression he wore all afternoon. For someone who had once been the closest person in my life, he'd never felt farther away. Grief made Tate deeply uncomfortable. By the time he was 20, he had already lost his grandfather, his grandmother, 4 cousins, Aunt Julia and Aunt Lydia. Most people would have expected so much loss to leave visible scars, but with Tate, it was impossible to tell. It was as if there were a wall inside him that refused to let grief in. He never cried, never spoke about the people he had lost, and never reminisced about them. Once someone died, he seemed to lock every memory of them behind a door that he refused to open. From the outside, I honestly couldn't tell the difference between Tate before someone died and Tate afterward. His routines never changed. His expression never softened. He never mentioned their names or shared stories about them. It was as though death simply became another fact to file away rather than something to mourn. I never knew whether he truly felt nothing or whether he felt everything and had convinced himself that showing it was impossible. Either way, grief seemed to be the one emotion Tate could never allow himself to experience. Once I woke from my nap around 11 in the evening, I crept down the hall toward Tate's bedroom, heart thudding in my chest. I reached for the knob, but it was locked. Of course. A resigned sigh escaped me as I pulled out the skeleton key that Talia had given me. One careful turn and the door clicked open. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the moon through the shutters. Tate lay on his stomach in the center of the bed, completely nude, his body relaxed, almost unnervingly limp. For a moment, relief washed over me. He wasn't awake, not yet aware of my presence. I stripped quickly, shedding my clothes like unraveling hesitation, and slid beneath the covers. The sheets smelled faintly of him, Tate, the warmth and tension of his body lingering even in sleep. I exhaled slowly, letting myself sink closer, finally daring the intimacy I had avoided all day. It wasn't even 10 seconds before disaster struck. A sudden, forceful kick propelled me off the bed. I crashed against the floor with a bone-jarring clunk, the air violently knocked from my lungs. Stars exploded in my vision as I struggled to inhale, my chest heaving, my body throbbing from the impact. Tate's eyes snapped open immediately, dark and furious, his pupils dilated, jaw tight. He didn't say a word, he didn't need to. Every muscle in his body radiated restrained anger, jealousy, and the quiet, burning obsession he carried for me. I groaned, rolling onto my side, trying to catch my breath while the sheets he'd so recently shared clung to me, the warmth now mocking in its absence. Tate's gaze locked onto me, and I realized with a sinking weight, nothing in this house was ever calm. Not tonight, not ever. Tate's eyes burned into me, dark and unblinking, every nerve in his body taut as a coiled spring. His bare chest rose and fell with shallow, measured breaths, but inside a storm raged, jealousy, possessiveness, and frustration all tangled together like fire and smoke. Tate had kicked Noah out of his bed and onto the floor. The sheer audacity of that backstabbing, disloyal, traitorous, gulling, and abandoning blonde bastard. A month ago, Noah had walked away with the one man Tate hated more than anyone else, leaving without looking back. Now he expected things to be the way they had always been. Not a chance. Every time Tate looked at him, the betrayal came rushing back. The anger simmering beneath his normally cold exterior refused to fade. As far as Tate was concerned, Noah had made his choice the day he left, and choices had consequences. If Noah wanted forgiveness, he was going to learn that it wasn't something Tate gave easily. Tate wasn't the kind of man who accepted apologies, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who handed out forgiveness. In all the years Noah had known him, Tate had never truly forgiven anyone for anything. A betrayal, an insult, a lie, a broken promise. Once someone crossed the line, they stayed on the other side forever. Tate never forgot, and he rarely believed people deserved a second chance. If someone disappointed him, he simply erased them from his life as though they had never existed. It wasn't because he enjoyed holding grudges. It was because, in Tate's mind, trust was absolute. Once it was broken, it couldn't be repaired. An apology was just words. Regret changed nothing. The damage had already been done. Yet the one person Tate had never imagined would betray him was the one person he believed never could. Noah. The skinny little blonde boy who had been at his side for nearly 20 years. The boy who had shared countless meals at Tate's table, worn clothes from Tate's closet, slept beside him night after night, laughed with him, argued with him, celebrated holidays with his family, and quietly woven himself into every corner of Tate's life. Tate had provided for Noah in every practical way he knew how. If Noah needed something, Tate bought it. If Noah was struggling, Tate fixed it. If Noah wanted comfort, there was always a place waiting beside him. Material things came easily to Tate. They were his way of saying what he rarely could with words. He had never questioned Noah's loyalty. Not once. Then from Tate's perspective, Noah had chosen someone else. Mark. Of all people. The man Tate despised more than anyone. To Tate, it wasn't simply that Noah had left for a month. It was who he had left with that made the wound feel unbearable. Every day Noah spent with Mark felt like another deliberate choice, another reminder that someone else had become more important than the one person who had always expected Noah to stay. What hurt Tate the most wasn't something he would ever admit aloud. Beneath the anger was a loneliness so profound that even he refused to acknowledge it. For nearly 30 nights, the massive bed in his dark bedroom had felt unbearably empty. He would lie awake in the silence, staring into the darkness where Noah had slept for years. The room felt colder than it ever had before, despite the expensive furnishings, the soft blankets, and every luxury money could buy. The emptiness wasn't caused by the size of the room. It was caused by the absence of the one person who had made it feel occupied. Tate would never describe the feeling as grief, he would never call it heartbreak. Those were emotions he refused to recognize in himself. Instead, he called it betrayal. It was a word he could live with. Because betrayal was easier than admitting that, for the first time in years, he had been forced to fall asleep alone, with nothing but the silence, the darkness, and thoughts he couldn't outrun. How dare he? Tate's mind screamed silently. How dare Noah think he could sneak in, think he could invade this bed, this space? How dare Mark's presence, his body, his scent, linger in Noah's life when Tate's hands had wanted to hold him, to claim him for so long? The audacity of it stung like salt in a wound. His body tensed, muscles flexing under skin like sculpted armor. Every fiber of him ached with need and fury. That foot, that single instinctive kick, it had been a warning, a boundary, a claim. Stay away, know your place and don't rise above your station. Noah wasn't allowed to forget that this was Tate's world, Tate's bed, and Tate's rules. Noah thought he was still Tate's Noe after 28 days sleeping away from Tate. Hell no, and yet. Yet the truth gnawed at him. He loved Noah so completely, intensely, and devotedly that harming him outright was impossible. He couldn't risk it, he wouldn't. The jealousy spiraled, vicious and quiet. Mark, that man lying so close to his Noe all summer. The thought of it ignited a fire in Tate's gut, twisting tighter with each imagined smile, each laugh shared without him. He pictured them together, felt the phantom heat of proximity, and almost growled aloud. His fists twitched, flexed, ready to strike anything nearby, anything that dared to take his place. And yet, he restrained himself. Because of Noah's distress, Noah's fear, that line was sacred. He couldn't cross it. The storm coiled in his chest, thrummed through his veins, and rattled in the hollow of his stomach. He was both predator and prisoner of his own obsession, and every heartbeat screamed the same truth. Noah was his in ways the world would never understand, and no one, Mark or otherwise, could change that. Tate exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. His rage was silent, simmering, an invisible weight pressing into the room. Every muscle remained taut, every eye locked on Noah, every thought a mix of longing, fury, and desperate, jealous need. He would wait, he would watch. And when Noah finally moved, finally reached for him, Tate would make sure he remembered exactly who he belonged to. The blonde groaned, teeth clenched, and forced myself to stand despite the throb in my ribs and the sharp ache radiating through my butt from the floor. Each step toward my side of the bed felt like wadding through lead, every movement reminding me that Tate's fury was still in the room, invisible but heavy. I lowered myself carefully onto the mattress, trying to ignore the lingering sting and the pounding of my heart. Relief was fleeting. Before I could even settle, a sudden, forceful kick sent me tumbling off his bed again. I landed with another clunk, wind knocked from my lungs, my back and shoulders slamming against the hardwood. Stars exploded in my vision and I gasped, trying to suck in air. Tate's dark eyes bore into me from the bed, every inch of him taut with restrained anger. I swore under my breath, sitting up slowly, rubbing my aching body. God, Tate, I muttered, exasperated, more in disbelief than in pain. He didn't speak, didn't even shift. Every muscle in his sculpted frame flexed subtly, his jaw tight, his hands twitching with barely contained possessiveness and jealousy. The kick had been a warning, a reminder, and perhaps even an assertion. This bed, this space, Noah himself, it was all Tate's, and he would make sure I never forgot it. I rubbed my butt, grimacing. "You're insane," I muttered, half in pain, half in exasperated awe. Tate's chest rose and fell, angry eyes still locked on me, dark and unyielding, the silent storm of his obsession and jealousy filling the room. I could feel it pressing down, palpable and suffocating, yet there was something magnetic about it, dangerous and raw, something that made it impossible to look away. I forced myself up again, every joint protesting, and made my way toward my spot on the bed. Relief flickered briefly until Tate shifted. His nude body moved with deliberate precision, stretching out, crossing the space I intended to sit in. Limbs strategically positioned, he blocked me completely, his massive, sculpted form looming over the mattress like a living barricade. Every movement was calculated, silent but screaming possession. Tate scowled at me, dark hazel eyes narrowing, every muscle taut. His chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths, yet the tension radiating off him was almost unbearable. "Get out," he hissed, voice low, raw with jealousy. "You have no fucking right to be here." The single word slithered through the room like a warning, sharp and venomous. His lips pressed tight, jaw clenched, every inch of his body screaming that this wasn't just a request, it was a claim. I froze, staring at him, caught between frustration and awe. "Tate, I began, but his scowl stopped me mid-word. He shifted slightly, still blocking me, and the heat of his body pressed against my side. Every inch of him radiated the same truth. He was furious, jealous, and utterly unwilling to let me have what he considered his. The footwork, the stance, the scowl, it was all calculated intimidation, a silent assertion of dominance that left me both exasperated and strangely aware of the raw, dangerous desire simmering beneath the surface. "Go," he repeated, voice harder this time, low and dangerous. "You don't sit here, not now, not ever again, cunt." I exhaled slowly, feeling the sting of humiliation and the pulse of tension in the room. He was mine, entirely and completely, but his jealousy, his obsession, and his refusal to give space were suffocating, infuriating, and impossible to ignore. I could feel my patience finally snapping. Weeks of confusion, rejection, and hurt came crashing together until I couldn't hold them back anymore. My jaw tightened, my hands curled into fists at my sides, and the frustration I'd been trying so hard to contain finally boiled over. "Fine," I growled, my voice trembling with anger and disappointment. "Your loss. I'm going back to Mark's warm, welcoming bed. I can think of 50 ways that Mark could keep me warm while you shiver in a cold bed due to your stupidity and pride." Saying it was a mistake, this knowledge didn't come fast enough to me. Before I could even turn, Tate lunged, strong, fast, impossibly close. I tumbled backward, crashing onto the floor with a thud, and before I could catch myself, he was on top of me. His body pinned mine, every muscle taut and unyielding, heat radiating off him in waves. My lungs fought for air under the weight of his arms, his chest pressing me down, but even in the suffocation, his touch was desperate, possessive, needy. "Leave," he hissed, voice low and trembling, almost breaking. "Get out, you're the worst thing I ever did." His anger was raw, jagged edges cutting through the air between us, but beneath it, something more vulnerable burned: fear, longing, obsession. His voice cracked, the edge of fury mixed with pain, disbelief, and heartbreak. You dare bring him here, get that man out of my house," he spat, teeth clenched, jaw rigid. The words were venomous, each syllable snapping in the room. "You dare bring him here." And still he refused to speak the name. Not Mark, not aloud, just the idea, the presence, the intrusion was enough to set him on fire. I struggled beneath him, both trapped and strangely intoxicated by the intensity of it. "Tate, I'm not leaving," I said, trying to steady my voice despite the air knocked from my lungs. "I'm here, I'm with you, only you." He froze for a heartbeat, every line of his body vibrating with tension, then tightened around me again as if proving to himself I couldn't escape. His breath was hot against my ear, words jagged and desperate. You don't get it, you don't even know what you ruin me every time." The heat, the rage, the obsession, it pressed down on me, suffocating and intoxicating. Every muscle, every scowl, every tense movement screamed that he wanted me entirely and would never, ever let me go. Tate climbed off me, every movement taut with frustration, but I didn't wait. I lunged for my spot on the right side of his bed, yanking the blanket up to my chin like a shield. Tate froze, dark eyes narrowing as he glared down at me. "Get out," he hissed, voice low and dangerous. "You don't deserve to be here." I didn't move, not a muscle, not an inch. His patience snapped. He leaned over, trying to push me off, and we tumbled into each other, rolling across the mattress, limbs tangled and slippery with sweat. His hands gripped me, mine gripping him back, each of us trying to assert control. The room was hot, suffused with the smell of skin and tension, the quiet thuds of bodies against the mattress echoing around us. For what felt like hours but was really just minutes, we wrestled, trapped in a game of dominance and obsession. Finally, around midnight, we both collapsed, breathing hard, sweat slicking our bodies, giving up the fight but not the tension. Tate ended up on top, chest heavy, arms braced beside me, dark eyes blazing down at me with that familiar mix of jealousy, fury, and need. I blinked up at him, heart hammering, and impulsively pressed my lips to his nose. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Tate jerked his head away sharply, scowl deepening, but the contact had stirred him. I felt his length pressing into my thigh, heavy and undeniable. Without thinking, I shifted slightly, moving against him deliberately, testing the boundaries of his control. Tate's dark eyes flicked down to where we were connected, jaw tightening. His breathing hitched, shallow and uneven, a silent acknowledgement of the tension neither of us could deny. The room was thick with heat, need, and unspoken obsession, the unrelenting mix of jealousy and desire that had defined our summers. And even though he still glared, still growled with possessive fury, a silent war of want and control had begun, one that neither of us wanted to end. I shifted Tate's member to keep it from pressing into me, but before I could fully adjust, his hand clamped around mine, forcing it to drop from my fingers. "Don't touch that," he hissed, his voice sharp with anger. I froze for a moment, letting the weight of his frustration hang in the air. Slowly, carefully, I moved my hands to his feet, beginning to rub them. At first he tensed, stiffening against my touch, but as I continued, tracing the arches and heels with gentle pressure, the tightness in his body began to ease. His breathing slowed and the harsh glare in his eyes softened into something more reluctant, almost indulgent. I reached down and gently touched the very feet that only moments earlier had kicked me off the bed twice. Now I was rubbing and massaging them, swallowing my pride as I tried to apologize to the 22-year-old adult toddler who was throwing a tantrum simply because I'd gone on a cruise. I hadn't abandoned him. I hadn't disappeared. I'd gone on a vacation for a few weeks, yet he was acting as though I'd betrayed him forever. Tate's initial resistance gradually gave way as my fingers worked over the soles and along the curves of his feet. Tate's jaw unclenched and the tension in his shoulders began to melt. The anger that had burned so fiercely a moment ago simmered down, replaced by a quiet, reluctant acceptance. He shifted slightly, letting me maintain contact, and a low, almost imperceptible sigh escaped him. The contrast was striking, his earlier fury fading under the simple, careful act of my hands on his skin. A quiet intimacy bridging the storm that had just raged between us. Tate dozed off as I continued massaging his feet, his body finally surrendering to sleep. I realized with a quiet surprise that I could calm him this way, that my touch could reach him where words couldn't. When I woke up at 9, the sun spilling across the room, I found myself lying on the floor. Tate had pushed me out of his bed while he watched above me, arms crossed, lips pressed into a tight line and eyes narrowed into a sharp scowl. He glared down at me, a storm of irritation and something unspoken simmering in his gaze. I pulled myself off the floor and cautiously tried to climb back into his bed. The instant I was within reach, he drove his foot into me again, sending me tumbling off the mattress and onto the hardwood floor. He scowled, raising his foot once more as a silent warning that if I dared try again, he'd kick me right back off his mattress. My backside still smarted from the heel of Tate's foot and from crashing onto the floor for the second time. Deciding I valued my ribs more than winning this ridiculous battle, I sighed, turned toward the door, and headed downstairs to eat breakfast, leaving behind a scowling 22-year-old toddler who stubbornly refused to share his warm bed with me. At breakfast, I tried to sneak a playful nudge under the table, brushing my foot against Tate's, but he ignored me, staring straight ahead like I wasn't even there. I nudged again, a little bolder this time, and he abruptly kicked my right foot, sharp enough to make me flinch. My cheeks burned as I recoiled, and the tension between us thickened like a storm cloud. After breakfast, Talia pulled me aside, her eyes serious. "Tate feels abandoned," she said quietly. "You need to show him you didn't mean to upset him. Don't force a confrontation before his jealousy festers." Her words hit me like a jolt. I realized that if I didn't face him head-on, the silence would only widen the gap. I had to go to him now, even if it meant walking straight into his glare. I took Tate's gun from its hiding place, and near the doorway I watched him tear through the garage, drawers slamming, frustration sharp in every movement while he searched for his missing weapon. "Looking for this," I said, holding it up in my right hand. His head snapped toward me, eyes blazing as he started forward. "Give it," he hissed. "Not until you listen," I shot back, stepping back just enough to set it on the top shelf of the tool rack out of his immediate reach. He stopped short, jaw tight, hands flexing at his sides. "I don't have anything to say to you, cunt," Tate spat, but he didn't walk away. "I went on a cruise," I said, my voice defensive, trying to steady it. "I'm not abandoning you, I told you where I would be." "No, you didn't," Tate accused. "You didn't leave me a note, you didn't call me, you didn't do anything." Tate lowered his eyes to the floor, his jaw tightening as the hurt bled through his anger. Then it hit Noah. The note. The goodbye note he'd carefully written and left on Tate's pillow the morning he had left with Mark for the cruise. Tate had never seen it. Noah's stomach sank as the realization settled over him. From Tate's point of view, Noah hadn't gone on a trip. He hadn't explained where he was going or when he'd be back. He hadn't said goodbye. He had simply vanished without a word. No wonder Tate believed he'd been abandoned. Somehow, the note Noah had left on the pillow had disappeared. Maybe it had slipped behind the bed. Maybe a gust of air had blown it onto the floor. Maybe someone had accidentally picked it up and thrown it away. Whatever had happened, the only proof that Noah had tried to tell Tate goodbye had never reached him. Noah opened his mouth to explain. "Tate, I left." "I don't want to hear anything," Tate cut him off. "Cunt, you abandoned me. You made me look like an idiot all summer. Do you think you can just leave and go sleep in someone else's bed after 20 years of sleeping beside me?" His voice cracked with anger. "I had to find out from my mother that you'd gone on a cruise with Mark. My own mother knew where you were before I did." Noah stood speechless, finally understanding the depth of the misunderstanding. "Just get out of here," Tate snapped, pointing toward the door. "Get out of here before I push you out of something beyond just onto my floor." Without waiting for a response, Tate stormed out of the bedroom. A heartbeat later, the bedroom door slammed so hard the walls seemed to shudder. Tate stumbled into the fourth-floor bathroom, his chest rising and falling with every angry breath. He braced both hands against the marble vanity, glaring at his reflection. Noah actually expected him to believe that ridiculous story about leaving a note. A note? Tate let out a bitter laugh. For nearly a month, he'd humiliated himself by lingering near the mailbox, standing outside the estate day after day, waiting for an explanation that never came. Every passing car had made him look up. Every afternoon, he'd wondered if Noah would finally come home or send word about where he'd gone. 2 long weeks had passed before his mother casually mentioned at the dining room table that Noah had gone on a cruise with Mark. That was how Tate had found out. Not from Noah. Not from a phone call. Not from a letter. From his own mother. His father had actually laughed, amused by the whole thing. He joked that Noah had finally gotten tired of Tate and left him behind, as though it were the funniest thing in the world. The memory still burned. The humiliation, the confusion, and the feeling of being abandoned twisted together until Tate could barely tell where one emotion ended and the next began. What made it even worse were those first few nights. Tate had climbed into a bed that suddenly felt enormous, cold, and empty. Night after night, he cried himself to sleep, staring at the bedroom door, hoping Noah would quietly come back, slip beneath the covers, and settle into the familiar place beside him. Noah ever did. Then he'd learn the truth. While he'd been worried sick, lying awake and wondering if something terrible had happened, Noah had been on a cruise with Mark. They'd been on vacation, relaxing, laughing, and enjoying themselves, while Tate had been left behind with no explanation. The realization had torn something inside him. His thoughts turned darker with every passing minute. Mark and Noah had probably been laughing together while he stood around like a fool, anxiously waiting for Noah to come home. In Tate's mind, he was the punchline, the pathetic idiot who had been the last person to find out where Noah had gone. The humiliation stung almost as much as the loneliness, and together they left him feeling raw, exhausted, and deeply betrayed. At lunchtime, Tate walked into the dining room and took his usual seat at the table. The moment he looked up, he froze. Mark. Mark was sitting there casually eating a grapefruit as though nothing in the world had happened. "Good morning," Mark said pleasantly before taking another bite. Tate stared at him. He had never wanted someone dead before, but Mark was getting dangerously close to that line. Across the table, Talia let out a quiet laugh. She could practically feel the hostility radiating from her son. "How did you sleep, honey?" she asked Tate. He didn't even look at her. "What is he doing here?" Tate demanded, glaring at Mark. "He's our guest," Talia replied calmly. "Now if you can't say something nice, be quiet." Tate answered with nothing more than a scowl. Just then Noah quietly entered the dining room. "Good morning, honey," Talia said warmly as Noah took a seat at the table. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Terrence, Tate's father, chuckled as he folded his newspaper and laid it on the dining room table. "Well," he said with a grin, "I now pronounce you man and wife." He looked back and forth between Mark and Noah. "So are you two engaged? When's the wedding?" he laughed. Before anyone could answer, Tate's face darkened. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he hurled his fork across the table. The utensil struck Mark squarely in the chest before clattering onto the floor. Mark jolted in surprise, rubbing the spot where it had hit him. "What the hell was that for?" he demanded. Tate's eyes blazed. "Get out," he hissed. Mark blinked. "I said get out." Tate also pointed at Noah, then toward the door, eyes blazing again to cover what slipped through. "Pack your suitcase and get out," Tate ordered. "Take the homewrecker with you." Noah didn't leave. Mark slipped out before dinner, and when he leaned in to kiss me goodbye, I caught Tate's movement out of the corner of my eye and I held Mark back, keeping things from exploding. The look on Tate's face said enough: sharp, possessive, unmistakably jealous, but he said nothing. That silence followed me all night as I took the spare room instead of his bed. I woke at 8 the next morning to Tate standing in the doorway, already dressed and tense. He didn't say good morning, just pointed at my suitcase like it was the only thing that mattered. He wanted me gone. I'd mentioned almost casually that Mark and I had talked about buying a house together, and under the table Tate's foot slammed into mine. Hard. I sucked in a breath, but across from us, Talia just nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, saying it sounded like a good idea. That only made the tension worse, thick and suffocating for the rest of the meal. Tate grabbed Noah by both shoulders and shoved him toward the dining room doorway, his grip trembling with anger. "Get out," Tate yelled. "Get out of my house." Noah stumbled backward, stunned by the force behind the shove. He didn't fight back. He simply stared at Tate, his face draining of color as he finally understood just how deeply he'd hurt him. "Tate, please," Noah said quietly. "Just let me explain. I never meant to abandon you." "You don't get to explain," Tate roared, giving Noah another shove toward the front hall. "You don't just abandon me and then come back as if nothing happened. Get out, and stay gone." Noah's eyes filled with hurt. He wanted to tell Tate about the note he'd left on the pillow, about how none of this had been intentional, but every attempt to speak was swallowed by Tate's rage. "Tate, I swear." "No." Before Tate could shove Noah again, Talia stepped between them, planting herself firmly in front of Noah. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp enough to silence the room. She placed a steady hand against Tate's chest, preventing him from driving Noah any farther toward the front door. "You are not throwing him out of this house," she said firmly, "not while you're this angry." Tate's chest heaved as he glared past his mother at Noah, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Noah remained where he was, shaken and speechless, realizing that an apology alone wasn't going to mend 20 years of trust in a single afternoon. Night came heavy with everything unsaid. Tate tried to push me out of the house again, his patience gone, but Talia stepped in and shoved him back, telling him to cut it out. He looked furious, childish, immature even, but underneath it was something unmovable. He meant it. He didn't want me there. I ignored him anyway and slipped into his room later, climbing into his bed like I always had. He reacted instantly, shoving at me, kicking me back toward the edge. "Keep out," Tate hissed, his voice low and sharp. "Your mom told me," I said, not backing off, "that you pined for me all summer." Tate flinched, the reaction quick but impossible to miss. "Give it up," I pushed, softer now but no less direct. "If you want me back, stop acting like you don't." I stayed where I was, refusing to move even when he glared at me like he wanted to drag me out himself. Slowly, I settled beside him, resting my head against his chest. His body was tense, rigid under me, his heartbeat fast and uneven, his breathing shallow like he was holding everything in. He didn't push me away again, but he didn't relax either, caught somewhere between anger and something he couldn't quite fight. I let out a small, disbelieving laugh, like maybe this was still part of last night's anger, something that would fade if I didn't feed it. Tate's expression darkened instantly. He stomped his foot, the sharp sound cracking through the room, his frustration spilling over in a way that was almost childish but no less real. I woke at 3 a.m. to the soft weight of Tate's hands in my hair, running slow, deliberate fingers along my scalp. He leaned down, pressing gentle kisses to my temple, his lips warm and possessive. Every touch was intense, like he was memorizing me, worshipping me in the quiet dark of the room. Between kisses, he swore, the words low and sharp, laced with jealousy. "Mark," he spat, using the name like a curse: home wrecker, sleep staler, and truck thief. His hands didn't stop moving, gliding over me like he couldn't keep them to himself. The anger in his voice was fiery, but underneath it all, I felt the raw intensity of how much he needed me, how much he wanted me there. Tate didn't let me back in right away. The days stretched into weeks, the space between us tense and silent, filled with everything we hadn't said. For a while, I stayed on the edges of his world, careful, waiting for him to let the walls drop. Even after the first night, Tate finally allowed Noah back into his bedroom, but things were far from normal. For the next 3 months, Noah slept alone in his own bed. Late each night, after the mansion had gone quiet, Tate would silently slip into Noah's room. He never invited Noah back to his own bed. Instead, he climbed into Noah's as though he wanted the comfort of Noah's presence while still clinging to the last bit of control he had left. The arrangement never changed. Night after night, Noah apologized. He pleaded with Tate to believe him, insisting he had written a note explaining where he was going before he left on the cruise with Mark. Every single time, Tate dismissed it. "I don't believe you," was all he would say. In Tate's mind, Noah had abandoned him. He believed Noah had chosen to leave with Mark without so much as a goodbye, and that wound refused to heal overnight. Trust, once broken, was painfully slow to rebuild. Then, after nearly 12 weeks, something changed. Noah didn't know what had happened. Tate never explained it. There was no dramatic conversation, no heartfelt confession, and no apology. One night, Tate climbed into Noah's bed as usual. Instead of lying stiffly on his side of the mattress, he quietly moved closer. A moment later, Tate wrapped an arms around Noah's waist and rested against him, holding him the way he always had before the cruise. Noah lay perfectly still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might make Tate pull away. He had no idea what had changed inside Tate. He only knew that, for the first time in months, it felt like the walls Tate had built around his heart had begun to crack. After Tate climbed into Noah's bed that night, the room remained silent for a long time. The only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioner and the rain tapping gently against the bedroom windows. Tate lay on his side, staring into the darkness, while Noah stayed perfectly still beside him, uncertain whether Tate wanted company or simply didn't want to be alone. Several minutes passed before Tate finally spoke. "I'm sorry." Noah blinked, convinced he'd imagined it. Tate swallowed hard. "I'm sorry for not believing you about the note. I'm so fucking stupid. Of course you left a note. I was so blind. Forgive me, Noe." Noah slowly turned to face him, surprised to find that Tate wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness that had consumed him for months had given way to something quieter, hurt. "I did leave you a note," Noah said softly. "I put it right on your pillow before I left. I wanted you to know where I was going. I never wanted you to think I'd disappeared." "I know," Tate answered after a long pause. "I believe you now. Fucking hell, the things jealousy makes people do." His jaw tightened as his hands curled into fists at his sides. The anger radiating from him wasn't directed at Noah. If anything, Noah's confession had extinguished the last trace of suspicion he had been carrying. Instead, Tate's fury had found a new target. He stared off into the distance, his temples throbbing as he replayed everything that had happened. The lies, the manipulation, the needless pain that had been inflicted simply because someone else's jealousy had spiraled out of control. "I can't believe they put you through that," Tate muttered, his voice low and strained. "All because they couldn't stand what we meant to each other." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by Tate's uneven breathing as he struggled to keep his temper in check. Relief washed over Noah so suddenly that his shoulders sagged. "You do." Tate nodded. "I don't think you lied about the note." For the first time in months, Noah felt as though he could breathe again. But Tate wasn't finished. "That doesn't mean it didn't hurt." Noah's expression fell. "I know," he whispered. "No," Tate shook his head. "I don't think you do." He looked down at the blanket gathered between his fingers. "You've got to go on a cruise with Mark for 4 weeks. You've got to have fun. Meanwhile, I was here sleeping by myself every night." His voice grew quieter. "I slept in a cold bed for 28 nights, wondering where you were. I thought something had happened to you, then I found out you were on vacation." He laughed once, but there wasn't any humor in it. "I felt like an idiot." Noah closed his eyes. "Tate." "For 18 years, Tate continued, we slept beside each other every single night, then one day you were just gone." "I never wanted you to think I'd abandoned you," Noah said, his voice breaking. "If I'd known you never got my note, I would have called the house, I would have come back, I would have done anything. I thought you knew exactly where I was." "I didn't." Those two words landed heavier than anything else Tate had said. I didn't know where you were, Tate repeated. I didn't know when you were coming back. I didn't know if you even wanted to come back. Noah felt guilt settle over him like a weight. I never stopped wanting to come back, he said quietly, not for one day. Tate nodded, accepting the words without arguing. I believe that now. He took a slow breath. But just because you had every right to go on a trip as an adult doesn't mean I wasn't justified in feeling left behind. Noah nodded immediately. You're right. I wasn't angry because you took a vacation, Tate said. I was angry because, from my point of view, you vanished. Then I had to spend 28 nights alone after spending 18 years falling asleep beside you. That wasn't easy. I'm so sorry, Noah whispered, tears gathering in his eyes. I can't give those nights back. I can't undo what happened, but if I could, I would. Tate studied him for a long moment. I know. Noah hesitated before carefully reaching for Tate's hand. This time Tate didn't pull away. Instead, he intertwined their fingers. It was a small gesture, but to Noah it meant everything. The anger wasn't completely gone and the hurt hadn't magically disappeared. There were still scars that would take time to heal. But for the first time since the cruise, Noah felt they were no longer standing on opposite sides of a wall. Together, they lay quietly in the darkness, holding onto each other as the distance between them finally began to disappear. When I woke up, Tate said quietly, you weren't in bed. He paused, his voice beginning to shake. You were just gone. Noah's heart sank. I didn't know about the cruise. I didn't know you'd left a note. I woke up and you had disappeared. Tate swallowed hard. I thought I'd done something to make you mad. I kept trying to figure out what I'd said or done that made you leave. He let out a shaky breath. I called you over and over, at least a dozen times. You never answered. Noah closed his eyes in pain. I thought, Tate whispered, sniffling, I thought you didn't want me anymore. The words struck Noah harder than anything else Tate had said. I'm so sorry. Noah whispered. Then 2 weeks later, Tate continued, Mom told me you'd gone on a cruise with Mark. He laughed bitterly through his tears. That's when I destroyed my room. The silence that followed was heavy. Slowly, Tate rested his face against Noah's chest and wrapped both arms tightly around him, holding on as though he never wanted to let go again. After a long moment, he spoke so quietly that Noah almost didn't hear him. Don't ever do that again. Noah's throat tightened. He gently wrapped his arms around Tate and held him just as tightly. I won't, Noah said, nodding against Tate's hair. If I ever have to leave again, I'll make sure you know exactly where I am. I'll tell you in person, I'll call, I'll do whatever it takes. I never wanted you to think I'd left you behind. Tate didn't answer. He simply stayed where he was, listening to Noah's heartbeat, the place he'd missed more than he had ever been willing to admit. I want Mark gone, Tate said. His voice was quieter now, but the hurt underneath it was unmistakable. I don't want any competition. Noah looked down at him, surprised by how much fear was still hiding beneath Tate's anger. You promised, Tate continued. You swore there wouldn't be any competition. You told me I was the person who mattered, then you left me for 4 weeks. His fingers tightened slightly against Noah's shirt. We've never even gone on a cruise together, not once, but you went on one with Mark. Noah didn't have an immediate answer. Tate's head rested against Noah's chest as Noah wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. I'm sorry, Noah whispered. Tate stayed silent. I should have told you before I left, Noah continued. I should have explained everything. I left the note because I knew if I told you in person you would have tried to talk me out of going. A small, tired smile crossed Noah's face. The last thing I wanted was to watch you stand at the door with those big, sad eyes, crying and trying to convince me not to get into the cab. Tate gave him a faint glare, though he didn't move away. You make it sound ridiculous. Because it was a little ridiculous, Noah teased gently, but it was also because I knew how much you cared. Tate sighed, resting against him again. The conversation didn't magically fix everything. There were still wounds from the misunderstanding, and there were still feelings they had to sort through. Tate had to learn that Noah's leaving for a trip wasn't the same as leaving him behind, and Noah had to learn that after nearly 2 decades of sharing their lives, disappearing, even unintentionally, had consequences. It took time. Slowly, painfully, and honestly, they both began working through the things that had hurt them. "I'm sorry about your mom," Tate said quietly. The words came after a long silence while the two of them lay together in bed. The anger that had consumed him for weeks was gone, replaced by regret. "I was so angry about you leaving," Tate admitted. "I was so focused on feeling abandoned that I forgot what you were going through." Noah looked down, saying nothing. "I should have been there for you," Tate continued. "I should have stood beside you at the funeral. I should have supported you instead of being angry and making everything about what I was feeling." He wrapped his arms around Noah and pulled him closer. "I'm sorry she died." Noah closed his eyes and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply held on to each other, both realizing that the hurt between them had never come from a lack of love. It had come from two people who were scared of losing each other and didn't know how to say it. That's when Noah broke. I cried into his shoulder, ugly and uncontrolled, the kind of crying that doesn't care who's watching. Tate wrapped both arms around me and held on like I was something precious he refused to lose. His thumb brushed over my knuckles again and again, a silent promise: "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." I don't know what I would have done without him that day. I also don't know how someone can be everything you need in your darkest moment and still never be the person you're allowed to want. But grief doesn't ask permission. Neither does love. So I stood at my mother's funeral holding the hand of the person who had been my real constant, my real home, and I let myself take comfort where it was offered, even if it came with a quiet ache I'd learned to live with. If nothing else, Tate showed up, and sometimes when the world collapses, that's the only thing that keeps you standing. The stress of losing an abusive, neglectful parent caused my eating disorder to affect my culinary consumption, so I stopped eating regularly for months. Not in a dramatic way, no big decision, no announcement to myself, I just forgot. Food stopped tasting like anything. Hunger felt distant, optional, like something that belonged to a different version of me. I stopped enjoying my hobbies, the books stayed closed, the records stayed silent. I stopped jogging, even though I'd run every day for years like it was a promise I made to my own body. Grief is a bitch like that. It doesn't crash in loudly, it erodes you. Quiet, patient, thorough. Nothing pulled me out of it, not time, not distractions, not Tate. He remembered the last time he had seen his mother fully alive, during Christmas of 1988. In his junior year at Brown, Tate had seen her standing in the kitchen with sunlight spilling across her face as she hummed a tune he could never place. How ordinary it had seemed. Now those ordinary moments pressed against him, vast and irreplaceable. The smell of her perfume lingered faintly on the pew where he had knelt. It was almost cruel in its subtlety, a reminder that she had existed fully and now she did not. Susie and Andrew brought me food and cleaned my room at the Blue House while Anna, Jack, Bree, and Susie stayed close, their presence a steady anchor as he moved through the ritual of farewells. Andrew had left quietly, leaving only a note. Andrew had lost his birth mother when he was younger, so it was easy to talk to him about my mom's death. Grief is a process, Noah. Notice it, accept it. It will reshape you, but it won't destroy you. You're loved and we're only a phone call away. Noah had folded it carefully, holding it like a talisman against the hollow ache in his chest. 3 months had passed since the funeral and Noah still felt unmoored. He returned to his mom's trailer each night and traced her face in old photographs, whispered her name into empty rooms, and let himself remember the soft weight of her hand on his shoulder. He missed her in ways that words could not hold. And yet life continued. Letters from Mark lay unopened on the desk, reminders of steady friendship and connection. Emails from Anna, Jack, and Susie offered warmth and humor, grounding him in a world that still spun forward even as he ached. Noah realized that grief did not erase the people he loved, it sharpened their presence, reminded him to hold them close. He thought of Tate, the storm of jealousy and obsession that had colored so many of his years, and he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Tate's shadow would always be a part of his story, but it was no longer the defining one. Mark's calm presence, his friend's laughter, Andrew's insight, they were the constants he could lean on, the patterns he could trust. Noah walked to the window and looked out over the campus, now empty and quiet in the evening light. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and he realized that even in loss the world remained alive. The flowers in the vase on the mantel, the sketches scattered across his desk, the books stacked haphazardly on the shelf, they were reminders that life, though fragile, endured. He sat down on the edge of his bed holding a small photo of his mother, tracing the lines of her face with his finger. "I'll be okay," he whispered, voice catching. "I'll really try." And for the first time in weeks, he believed it. Not because the ache had lessened, but because he understood that grief could coexist with hope, that love could persist even after loss. Noah picked up his sketchbook and began to draw, lines flowing freely without judgment. The image that emerged was of a tree, strong and rooted, branches stretching skyward. Each stroke was deliberate yet unrestrained, a symbol of resilience, growth, and the quiet courage of moving forward. The future remained uncertain. Tate's presence, Mark's steady influence, the ever-watchful Andrew and his friends' unwavering support, all of it wove into a life still unfolding. Noah exhaled slowly, allowing himself to feel the depth of his grief and the warmth of the connections around him simultaneously. It had been hard for Noah to leave his mother behind. Their relationship had always been complicated, carrying years of pain that he rarely talked about. His mother had known Noah was gay long before he left for Brown, and instead of accepting him, she had made comments that stayed with him for years. She would bring up his father, saying it was fortunate that he had died before he ever learned his son was gay. The words had cut deeper than Noah ever admitted. No matter what Noah accomplished, it never seemed to matter. He had been valedictorian of his high school class, he had excelled in college, he had worked hard and built a life he could be proud of. But none of it changed the way his mother saw him. She wasn't proud of the son she had raised, not because he had failed, not because he had disappointed her academically or personally, but because he loved men instead of women. The most painful thing she had ever said came during their last conversation in 1988. She told Noah that she had once wanted to have an abortion but couldn't afford the procedure. Noah never forgot those words. They stayed with him even years later. But he never told anyone. Not Tate, not his friends, not anyone who loved him. Noah carried the pain quietly, choosing to let the past remain buried rather than force the people around him to carry the weight of his mother's cruelty. At the funeral, he had stood there grieving not only the loss of his mother, but also the loss of the relationship he had always wished they could have had. He whispered one final time into the empty room inside the trailer, "I love you, Mom, I'll be okay, I promise." And for the first time in a long while he felt it, not the absence, not the weight, not the ache, but the quiet certainty that life, fragile as it was, could still be beautiful. After I sold the trailer and remained with Tate at the Blue House, I felt better, but I was still a mess. Tate tried. God, he tried. He cooked and nudged plates toward me, pretended not to notice when I pushed them away untouched. He sat with me on the porch at night, shoulder pressed to mine, like proximity alone might anchor me back to myself. He talked about anything, movies, stupid news stories, memories from when we were kids, like if he kept me tethered to the past long enough, I might remember how to live in the present. But grief doesn't care how much someone loves you, it swallowed everything anyway. Susie came to visit me about a month after the funeral. She took one look at me and froze in the doorway as if she'd run into a ghost. "Noah," she said softly. I hadn't realized how bad it was until I saw her face. The way her eyes flicked over me, my clothes hanging wrong, my cheeks hollowed out, my wrists too thin, I'd lost weight without noticing, without trying. My body had been grieving right along with me, shedding pieces like it didn't see the point in holding on. She hugged me carefully as I might break. When she pulled back, she cupped my face in her hands, thumbs brushing under my eyes. "You're disappearing," she said, not accusing, just scared. I shrugged because it felt easier than answering, "I'm fine." She didn't argue, she never did when the lie was that obvious. Instead, she sat with me on the bed I barely slept in and just stayed. She talked when the silence got too heavy, she let it stretch when I needed it to. At one point she handed me a granola bar and said gently, "Just a few bites for me." I took them 3 bites, it felt like climbing a mountain. Later, when Tate came home and saw her there, relief flickered across his face so fast it hurt to watch. Like he'd been carrying this alone and didn't know how much longer he could. That night, after Susie fell asleep on the couch, Tate sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor. "I don't know how to help you," he said quietly, "and that scares the hell out of me." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault. That grief had its own gravity, that love, even his, couldn't always pull someone back from the dark. But the truth was, I didn't know how to help myself either. So I lay there, smaller than I used to be, wrapped in loss I couldn't explain, while the person who loved me most watched helplessly from the edges. And for the first time in my life, even Tate couldn't reach me. I was an orphan now. That word landed differently once it was true, once there was no technicality left, no distant parent I barely spoke to, no emergency contact that wasn't my best friend. Just me, alone in a way I'd never practiced for. My depression got so bad that Tate was afraid to leave me by myself. He stopped going out unless I went with him. He timed his drives so he was never gone too long. He started waking up in the middle of the night just to make sure I was still breathing, like grief might steal me quietly if he blinked too long. When I slept, he slept lighter. When I stared at the walls, he sat on the floor in front of me so he could remain close to me and share physical space with me. It escalates over a few days until one morning, he woke up and refused to tolerate the elephant in the room anymore. "Enough," he said one morning, voice tight, hands on my shoulders. He was scared, really scared, and Tate only ever got like that when he thought he was about to lose something he didn't know how to replace. "You're going to a doctor today, I don't care if you hate me for it." I didn't argue, I didn't have the energy. He drove, he filled out the paperwork when my hands shook too much. He answered questions when my mouth refused to open. When the nurse weighed me at 125 pounds, Tate looked away as if the number physically hurt him. I had lost 40 pounds since my mom died, and it terrified the fuck out of my friends. The doctor was kind in that calm, practiced way, clinical but not cold. He talked about complicated grief, major depressive disorder, and how loss can shut down the body as much as the mind. He asked about appetite, sleep, and motivation. I shrugged a lot. Tate answered the rest. At some point, the doctor looked at Tate and asked, "Are you family?" Tate didn't hesitate. "Yes." No qualifiers, no explanations. That night back at home, Tate made soup and sat across from me at the table until I finished half the bowl. He didn't push for more, he didn't praise me like a child, he just nodded like we'd crossed a fragile bridge together. "You scared me," he said later, sitting beside me on the bed, voice rough. "I can't lose you too." I stared at my hands. "I'm not trying to go anywhere." "I know," he said quickly, "I know that, but grief doesn't ask permission." He leaned his forehead against mine, something he only did when he was overwhelmed. "I need you here, Noah, even if you're quiet, even if you're sad, just here." That was the thing about Tate. He didn't know how to save me, but he refused to abandon me while I figured it out. And even in the worst fog of my life, when love felt distant and the future felt fictional, I knew this much: I was still alive because someone loved me enough to be afraid. My eating disorder improved, but it never really left. It just got quieter, better at hiding. Tate saw me eating again, saw color creep back into my face, saw the scale move in the right direction, and he relaxed. He thought the crisis had passed. It hadn't. It had just learned how to behave. Susie called every single day. No exaggeration, sometimes twice. She never pushed, never tried to fix me. She talked about nothing and everything: what she cooked, who annoyed her in class, and some dumb art theory argument. Some days I barely spoke and she didn't care. She stayed on the line anyway, like silence itself was company. She wasn't the only person from Brown who did that. Jack and Anna came or called to help. Andrew sent flowers while Bree cooked and cleaned. Grief doesn't move in a straight line, it circles, it digs, it resurfaces when you think you're done with it. It took 2 full years before the loss stopped feeling like an open wound and started feeling like scar tissue, still tender, still there, but no longer bleeding every time I breathed. Losing my mom meant losing everything tied to the Lunas name. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no childhood home is worth revisiting, just me and a paper trail of what used to exist. I inherited $200,000 in the trailer. Seeing it written out like that felt obscene, like money was trying to apologize for something it could never replace. I didn't touch it. I put every cent into savings with the vague idea that one day I'd buy a house. A real one, something permanent. Something that couldn't be taken away in one phone call. Tate never once asked me what I planned to do with it. He just said, "Good, you'll be safe," like that was the only thing that mattered. Noah sat in the small, sunlit corner of the spare room, the morning light spilling over his sketchbooks and half-finished canvases. It felt different this morning. He didn't wake with the weight of the world pressing into his chest, didn't feel the familiar tightness that had made eating, breathing, and moving through life feel like wading through mud. It was as if the storm inside him, the one that had roared since his mother's death a year ago, since Tate's obsessive pull, since years of being caught between desire, obligation, and fear, had finally begun to settle. The dark depression that had shadowed him for months, threatening to crush him under its weight, seemed lighter, less insistent. He caught himself making breakfast without measuring, without obsessing over calories or portion sizes. The food went down easier. The anxiety around it, the rituals and the fear wasn't gone, but it was no longer the center of his life. For the first time in what felt like months, he ate without guilt. Tate's presence in his mind had shifted too. He thought of him not with the same compulsion, jealousy, or tension that had dominated so many years, but with a sense of relief. The realization that losing a mother who hadn't really cared, loved, or understood him was painful, yes, but it had also forced him to confront his life in a way nothing else could. The grief, the heartbreak, the betrayal, it had been brutal, but it had pushed him forward. Tate would never understand the depth of what Noah had endured, nor could he. Tate came from a loving, supportive home with 2 devoted parents and kind, nurturing relatives, but that didn't matter anymore. Noah wasn't trapped by Tate's obsession, his jealousy, or his impossible expectations. He was free to step into the next chapter of his life, and that freedom, hard-won, messy, and bittersweet, was exhilarating. He finished his breakfast and moved to the small desk by the window. His sketchbook lay open, waiting. He thought of Mark and the calm steadiness that had grounded him, of Andrew and the quiet clarity of his observations, and of Anna, Bree, Jack, and Susie, who had been constant pillars of support. They hadn't fixed him. They hadn't erased the grief, but they had given him space to heal, to notice his patterns, to rebuild himself piece by piece. Noah ran his fingers across the page, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his hands. He didn't need to dwell on Tate's intensity, on the jealousy that had once consumed him. That chapter was closing, and a new one he could control, was beginning. The thought made him smile, a small, genuine curve of his lips that hadn't been there in weeks. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The streets were alive with movement, people walking, laughing, arguing, living, and so would he. He had survived loss, betrayal, and obsession. He had survived grief, and now the world waited. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't guaranteed, but it was full of possibilities. For the first time, Noah allowed himself to consider the future without fear. Maybe he would start his own business, something creative, something that would allow him to pour himself into work that mattered. Maybe he would take a job, gain independence, and learn to navigate the world on his own terms. He felt a thrill imagining the freedom, the autonomy, the chance to build a life that was entirely his own. Tate wanted Noah to take some nutrition classes, a way to show me how to eat properly, how to nourish myself instead of letting my eating disorder control me. At first, I resisted. I didn't like the idea of someone telling me how or when to eat, but Tate was relentless, not in a way that made me feel trapped, but in a way that made me feel cared for. He had a stubborn kind of love that refused to let me slip into harm. I worked with a dietitian, learning about foods, learning about my body, learning about what it truly meant to feed myself, not just survive but live. Some days were easy, some days weren't. Some days I had to poke myself with a fork just to take a bite, laughing awkwardly when Tate rolled his eyes but smiled anyway. He didn't scold me, he didn't sigh, he just stayed. He reminded me to eat, guided me through the small victories, and celebrated the tiny triumphs with the quiet intensity that had always made him who he was. I gained 20 pounds over the course of 3 months, 20 pounds of flesh that felt like armor against the habits that had once controlled me. I went from 140 pounds of constant anxiety about every bite, every calorie, to a body that actually wanted to exist, to participate, to take up space in the world. Eating became a rhythm rather than a battlefield. I set alarms to remind myself, but Tate made it fun. He'd poke me playfully, call me stubborn, tell me I was being dramatic, and I couldn't help but laugh. He never stopped caring. Even when he was frustrating, even when I wanted to push him away, even when the old habits threatened to pull me under, he remained there, a steady anchor. He reminded me that recovery wasn't just about food. It was about trust, about patience, about being allowed to exist fully in my own body and mind. And in doing that, he gave me something I had never had before: freedom. Looking back, I realized that his insistence on my well-being wasn't controlling, it was love in its purest, most stubborn form. It was relentless care, the kind that insists you survive, insists you grow, insists you learn to want yourself back again. And I did. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, I did. Noah woke one morning and noticed, almost with disbelief, that the heavy fog in his chest had lifted just a little. It wasn't gone, grief didn't vanish in a single night, but it no longer anchored him entirely to the floor. He could breathe without a constant ache pressing in his lungs. The dark hours he had spent staring at the ceiling, counting every failure, every misstep, every memory of his mother's absence, had loosened their grip. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to reconnect with the world. Breakfast no longer felt like a battle. He could pour cereal without panic, slice fruit without fear, and even eat without overthinking every bite. The dietitian sessions that Tate had insisted on had become a lifeline. Each meeting, each carefully measured meal, each small victory in eating properly became a brick in the foundation of his recovery. "You're doing better today," Tate had said one evening, nudging him lightly as Noah poked a fork through his scrambled eggs. His voice wasn't controlling, it was insistence wrapped in care. Noah had smiled, a real small smile, the first in weeks. I am," he admitted, the truth tasting strange but good. Tate just nodded and sat with him in quiet solidarity. Even beyond eating, Noah felt himself shifting. He began sketching again, letting his hands move freely across the page, capturing light and shadow without judgment. Each line was an act of reclamation, a declaration that he could still create, still feel, still exist fully. His friends had been an anchor too. Anna called nearly every day, her voice full of laughter and warmth. Jack sent jokes and absurd stories. Susie dropped by with quiet offers of companionship. Andrew, always precise in observation, continued to offer insight and perspective, but now Noah could listen without feeling overwhelmed, without being consumed by every detail. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by loss. He thought of Mark's calm presence, of Tate's intensity tempered now by distance, of the friends who had carried him through the storm. The pain of his mother's absence remained, but he no longer feared it would crush him completely. Each morning, Noah woke and felt a quiet pulse of determination. Grief was part of him, yes, but it was no longer the entirety of who he was. He could laugh, even faintly. He could eat. He could draw. He could breathe. And most importantly, he could imagine moving forward. It was time to step into the next phase of his life, one he could shape himself in. Maybe he would start his own business, something creative that allowed him to merge his talent and ambition. Maybe he would take a job, gain independence, and learn to navigate life on his own terms. Whatever it was, he now had the energy, clarity, and hope to pursue it. Noah looked out the window at the sun spilling across the city streets, the world alive and moving despite everything he had lost. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't felt in months: joy. Not the loud, careless kind, but a quiet, steady warmth that told him he was ready to live again. Tate had been there every step of the way in his own complicated way. Not perfect, not unflawed, but present. He had insisted Noah take the diet classes, had sat through countless appointments with him, had helped him measure progress not in pounds alone but in habits, in confidence, in the courage to reclaim his body from the years of fear. Slowly, meticulously, Noah had learned to eat again without guilt, without dread. He had gained 20 pounds, yes, but more importantly, he had gained something he hadn't realized he'd lost: trust in himself. "You're smiling," Tate said suddenly, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. His voice was soft, careful, not teasing as it might have been in the past. "That's different." Noah laughed quietly, the sound lighter than he expected. "Yeah, I think I am. I don't feel like I'm underwater all the time." Tate pushed off the doorframe and came closer, settling on the floor beside him. He didn't crowd, didn't demand attention, just sat. The years of jealousy, obsession, and tension were still there in the shadows, but they no longer controlled the space between them. "Good," Tate said finally, "you deserve that." Noah's eyes lingered on him. "You know, it's weird, I was so angry at you for a long time. I thought you'd never let me breathe." "I know," Tate admitted, the corners of his mouth softening. "I wasn't great at letting people have their space, but I've always cared about you, Noah, even when I messed up." Noah nodded, feeling the truth in those words in a way that cut through the years of pain. He remembered the early chaos, the fights, the jealousy, the obsession, but he also remembered the constancy. Tate's care hadn't always been easy to bear, but it had never truly vanished. And now, in the calm after the storm, that care felt steady, tangible, and real. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of the city outside, to the faint clatter of dishes in the common area, to the quiet rhythm of their own breathing. Noah felt the tension that had once defined every interaction with Tate melt into something softer, something collaborative, something hopeful. "I think I'm ready," Noah said, almost to himself. "Ready to move forward, to do things I've wanted to do but couldn't because I was stuck." Tate tilted his head, curious. "Like what?" Noah smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement he hadn't realized he'd missed. "Maybe start my own business or a job that matters, something I can build, something mine." Tate nodded slowly. "That sounds amazing, and I'll be here if you want me to be." Noah felt warmth spread through his chest. He had spent years navigating obsession, jealousy, control, and grief, but this was different. Tate's presence was no longer a storm to survive, it was a grounding force, steady and reliable. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever would be, but it was something real and it was enough. "Thanks," Noah whispered, "for not letting me fall apart completely." "You never did, Noah, you just let me help you see you weren't alone," Tate said quietly. Noah looked out the window, at the sunlight dancing on the sidewalks, at the students walking to class, at the city moving on with or without him. He realized that he too could move forward. Life was fragile, messy, unpredictable, but it was also beautiful, filled with connections, love, and possibility. He could take the lessons he had learned, the patience, the care, the love, the strength, and build something new, something that belonged to him. He turned back to Tate, a sense of quiet joy filling him. "I'm ready," he said again, more firmly this time. "I'm ready for the next part." Tate smiled, a small, steady curve of his lips. "Then let's go," he said and held out his hand. Noah took it without hesitation, feeling the warmth, the strength, the promise in that touch. They rose together, side by side, stepping out into a world that was still uncertain, still fragile but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long while, Noah felt it clearly: hope, forward momentum, the knowledge that no matter what storms came, he could survive them and even thrive. This was the end of one chapter, yes, but the beginning of everything else. Noah smiled again, letting it fill him completely. He was ready. Talia invited us over for dinner not long after. She lived 5 minutes away, close enough that I could pretend for a few hours that I still belonged somewhere. Seeing her, my surrogate mom, the woman who had fed me most of my meals growing up, did something soft and painful to my chest. She hugged me longer than necessary, kissed my cheek, made too much food on purpose. "You're too thin," she said gently, the way only someone who loves you is allowed to say it. I smiled and lied. Tate watched me carefully across the table, like he was memorizing me again, making sure I was still real. For a few hours I felt held, not fixed, not healed, just held, and for the first time since everything fell apart, that felt like enough. Tate was sprawled on the couch in the living room, half watching the game with Terrence, yelling at the TV as if it could hear him. The sound of commentators and clinking bottles drifted into the kitchen where Talia and I stood shoulder to shoulder, chopping vegetables in a comfortable rhythm. She glanced toward the living room, then back at me. Her voice dropped, not secretive, just careful. "Is Tate taking care of you?" she asked. "He promised me before you left for Brown that his focus would be on looking out for you, for me." My hands paused mid-slice. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because the truth was complicated in a way that didn't fit neatly into words. "Yes," I said finally, "he does." Talia nodded slowly, like that confirmed something she'd always known. "Good," he was so serious about it, practically swore an oath. She smiled to herself. "That boy loves you." The word landed heavier than she intended. I swallowed and forced a small smile. "He's a good man." She hummed, unconvinced but not pushing. Talia had always been like that, seeing more than she said, choosing kindness over interrogation. She handed me a spoon. "Taste this." I did. It was good, comforting, familiar. "He worries," she added gently. "I can see it. He watches you like he's afraid you'll disappear if he blinks." I laughed under my breath. That sounds like Tate. Out in the living room, he shouted something at the referee, outraged on principle. Terrence laughed, normal, easy, like nothing had ever gone wrong. Talia reached over and squeezed my wrist, flour on her fingers. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, Noah. You know that, right?" I nodded, throat tight. "I'm trying," I said. She smiled at me the way mothers do when they know trying is the bravest part. Talia didn't stop stirring the pot, but her eyes softened. "He told me you lost a lot of weight," she said gently, "and that you sank into a deep depression for 2 years. I lost my mom when I was 19. She paused. "It still hurts sometimes." I nodded, staring at the cutting board like it might give me answers. "My mom wasn't a good mom," I said quietly. "She was absent, verbally abusive, and neglectful." Talia set the spoon down. "Is that why you were always over here?" she asked, not accusing, just curious, tender. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Yeah, this place was loud, warm. You noticed when I was hungry." I smiled faintly. "You asked questions." She reached out and brushed a crumb off my sleeve the way she always had. You needed somewhere to land. I did, I said, and Tate. I stopped, shook my head. He made it feel like I belonged somewhere, like I wasn't just extra. Talia nodded, understanding too much. Children know where they're safe, she said, they always have. From the living room, Tate whooped at a replay, thumping the couch with his fist. The sound grounded me, familiar as breathing. I'm sorry your mom couldn't give you what you deserved, Talia said. That doesn't make your grief smaller, sometimes it makes it heavier. My throat tightened. I didn't know how to miss someone who wasn't really there. She squeezed my hand. You're allowed to grieve the mother you had and the one you needed. I blinked fast and nodded. I think that's what helped me. Mark helped. Who? Talia blinked at me, waiting for more. Mark, she repeated, like she wanted me to say it again in a way that made more sense. I leaned back in the chair, trying to keep my expression light. Yeah, Mark, I said, as if it was obvious. He helped me get through it, kept me grounded. Tate's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I noticed it immediately, but I didn't look at him right away. I kept talking instead, like it was nothing. We've been talking about maybe traveling after graduation. Nothing is set in stone yet. That did it. I glanced over just in time to catch his face shift, subtle at first, then sharp, like he was trying to decide if I was serious or just being deliberately annoying. I smiled at him, soft and easy, the kind of smile that could pass for a joke if you didn't know me too well. He didn't know what to do with it. Tate's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning my face like he was trying to find the punchline I hadn't given him yet. He went back to his pie, but slower now, like the sweetness had turned unfamiliar. Talia, oblivious to the tension, perked up. Traveling where? I shrugged. Anywhere really, just getting out for a while. Tate finally set his fork down with a quiet clink. Oh, he said at last, flat and careful, so that's a real thing. I tilted my head. Maybe. That word landed harder than anything else I could have said. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. Right, maybe. And for the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at the pie at all. He was looking at me like I had just moved something important without telling him where I put it. Talia had just asked again what really helped me get through the last 6 months of school and everything. I took a breath, steadying myself. Mark was the one who got me through the last 6 months, I said simply, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. Talia smiled right away, her hand settling warmly on my shoulder. I'm glad, honey. For a second it felt easy, familiar, safe. Then I glanced over at Tate. He had stopped eating. His fork hovered over his pie, completely still, like the motion had been cut off mid-thought. His eyes were already on me, sharp, disbelieving. I kept my expression calm, almost light, like it wasn't a big statement at all. Tate pushed his pie saucer away with a scrape. Mark, he said, voice tight, Mark got you through this. I blinked, but he didn't give me space to answer. He doesn't even live here, Tate went on, gesturing sharply now. He stopped by 4 times a week. I'm the one who got you to the bathroom, the doctor, and to the dining room table. His voice rose, cracking at the edges. I was here, he said, louder now. I was the one holding it together while you were falling apart. Talia's hand slipped off my shoulder. Tate, I started, but he cut right through me. But Mark's the one who got you through it, he snapped, staring at me like I'd insulted him in front of everyone. That's what you're saying. The room went silent. Tate gave a short, broken laugh, pushing back from the table. Fuck you, he said, standing so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. And then he just stood there for a beat, breathing hard, like he was trying not to say anything else he couldn't take back. Then he turned and left the room. After his mother died, something inside Noah didn't just break, it went quiet. The world kept moving in the way it always does after a loss. People returned to work, conversations resumed their normal rhythms, and time continued without asking for permission. But Noah didn't experience it that way. For him, grief wasn't an event he passed through, it was a state he lived inside. It dulled everything else. School, relationships, even basic decisions felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. What made it harder was the way his grief tangled with guilt. He wasn't just mourning her absence, he was replaying every moment he thought he should have done differently, every unanswered call, every conversation cut short, every assumption that there would always be more time. That kind of thinking doesn't just hurt, it traps a person in the past, constantly negotiating with something that can't respond. During that period, Mark became one of the only stable presences in Noah's life. Not because he solved everything or said the perfect things, but because he simply stayed. He showed up consistently in a world that had started to feel unreliable. That consistency mattered more than Noah initially understood. When someone is grieving, predictability becomes a kind of safety. Even small routines, someone checking in, sitting nearby, making sure they ate, can function like anchors. But even Mark couldn't carry the emotional weight of Noah's entire recovery. And deep down, Noah knew that. There is a point in grief where outside support can only go so far because the real work becomes internal. It's the work of accepting permanence, accepting that the person is not coming back, that life will never return to what it was, and that continuing forward does not mean forgetting. That acceptance did not come to Noah suddenly. It came in fragments, a moment in the morning where the absence felt slightly less sharp, a memory that no longer made him collapse but instead just made him pause, a conversation where he realized he could speak his mother's name without losing control of his breath. These were small shifts, but together they formed a slow structural change in him. Once he began to accept her death not as something okay, but as something real and final, he experienced something unexpected: space, emotional space. Not happiness, not peace exactly, but room to consider things outside survival. Room to notice that he had been living in a narrowed corridor of existence where everything was about enduring rather than living. It was in that space that Mark's suggestion about traveling resurfaced in Noah's mind. At first, the idea of a trip had seemed absurd. Noah had been too emotionally depleted to imagine movement, let alone travel. Travel implies momentum, curiosity, openness, qualities grief often suppresses. But as his acceptance deepened, the idea changed shape. It stopped being escape and started being transition, a bridge between who he had been during his grief and whoever he was becoming afterward. Mark, for his part, never presented the idea as something intense or symbolic. He framed it casually, almost lightly, the way someone might suggest taking a break from routine. That mattered. If Mark had made it feel like a dramatic healing journey, Noah would likely have rejected it outright, but because it was simple, it felt possible. Before he had come out fully, or before he had felt safe in doing so, Noah's emotional world had been split into compartments. There was the version of himself that existed publicly and the version of himself that existed privately. Grief had collapsed those compartments because grief strips away performance. When someone is in deep mourning, they stop maintaining the same social masks. Everything becomes too heavy for pretense. In that sense, Noah's emotional state after his mother's death paradoxically made him more honest with himself. And once that honesty was established, returning to old patterns of concealment or emotional isolation became harder to sustain. That reduction in psychological load mattered more than Noah could initially articulate. When someone has been carrying grief, identity stress, and emotional exhaustion simultaneously, even small reductions in internal pressure can feel like breathing again after being underwater. Mark's presence was also significant, but not in the simplistic way Talia or even Tate might interpret. Mark was not a replacement for Noah's grief, nor was he positioned as the solution to anything. Instead, he functioned as continuity. Noah's life after his mother's death had become fragmented, days that didn't connect cleanly to one another, emotional states that shifted without warning. Mark represented a thread that linked those fragments. Mark was less about escaping, and more about testing a new version of reality, one where Noah could exist outside of grief without feeling like he was betraying the memory of his mother. This is an important psychological threshold. Many people unconsciously believe that if they begin to enjoy life again too quickly, it means they did not love the person they lost deeply enough. Noah had that belief, even if he never said it out loud. Another layer was curiosity, something Noah had almost forgotten he still had. Grief narrows a person's future orientation. It makes the horizon disappear. But once acceptance begins, curiosity can slowly return. Not the curiosity of ambition or career planning, but the basic human curiosity of what else is there. There is also an interpersonal element that cannot be ignored. Mark mattered to Noah. Not as a savior and not as a replacement for anyone, but as a person who had been present during one of the most fragile periods of his life. Shared experiences during grief often create a bond that is difficult to explain externally. It is not necessarily romantic in origin, nor purely platonic in a simplistic sense. It is rooted in witnessing. Mark had seen Noah at his worst and he had not turned away. That creates trust of a very specific kind. His mother's death, so many aspects of his life had been reactive. He responded to emergencies, to obligations, to emotional demands. Choosing to go somewhere, choosing leisure, was an assertion that his life was no longer defined only by response. It was a decision made from desire rather than obligation. Even the reactions of others in his life, like Tate's later anger or confusion, highlight the deeper emotional truth behind the decision. And once grief stopped being total, life became possible again in small, tentative steps. The first time I went over to Tate's house, it felt like stepping into a different world. It was as if I'd accidentally crossed into a life I wasn't supposed to access. The mansion had 6 levels, the kind I had only seen in movies or on magazine covers. It was all clean lines, warm light, and quiet luxury that spoke for itself. I remember standing there at the entrance a moment too long, just trying to make sense of it. It was beautiful but not cold or untouchable. It felt lived in. Victorian touches blended with modern design, wide staircases, tall windows that let sunlight in as if it belonged there, and rooms that felt open, not empty. I remember thinking almost absurdly that this house probably cost millions, 5 maybe more. Later, during a second sleepover, I saw something in the trash, a casually discarded magazine clipping or listing that confirmed what I already suspected. I loved the mansion the first time I stayed there,